What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so getting into the Unworthy Thor versus the Mighty Thor from Marvel Generations, this again is one of those stories that picks up after Secret Empire. We finished Secret Empire, that's all done. You'll find that playlist down in the description, but that playlist is designed to start with Secret Empire and the stories that led into it, and then go all the way through Marvel Legacy, Marvel Generations, that kind of a thing. Now, a lot of people speculate that Secret Empire was basically supposed to lead into an era where it was basically like Dark Reign for the most part. But the idea is that because of the backlash of Secret Empire, that Marvel basically changed it. And so what we ended up getting was like Marvel Legacy, where things were basically supposed to be like Marvel's version of DC Rebirth. Generations is what leads into Legacy. It's kind of like these connecting stories. But what they do is they're really just one-shots, and they feature the current roster of characters teaming up with their original characters. Now, the way that this goes is this really focuses on, of course, Unworthy Thor, who's basically Odin's son, who in the current story arcs cannot wield his hammer, and then Jane Foster Thor, who is the one picking up the hammer of Thor. But the idea here is that this focuses on these two characters meeting each other from two different eras in time. And so this initially picks up with Odin's son back when he was younger, trying to pick up his hammer. Now, the funny thing about this is that writer Jason Aaron really kind of being like the foremost writer on Thor at the moment, the guy who wrote, really started with Thor God of Thunder, who's been writing everything going into the current story arcs right now. He's drawing inspiration from a particular story, but also changing it. One of the biggest misconceptions about Odin's son is that people will say that he went through like all these trials and tribulations and struggles and different things like that in order for him to be able to pick up his hammer. That's actually not true. After the events of Thor Ragnarok, when Marvel basically removed Odin's son from the landscape, what they ended up doing was releasing like all these little mini stories, things like that, just to keep Thor fresh in the mind of people, so that once Civil War ended and Odin's son came back, it would be a highly anticipated thing. What they ended up doing was publishing one story. It was actually a 12-part series called Thor Son of Asgard. Now, the funny thing about this is that it was written by a guy named Akira Yoshida. People say he's fake. They say like it's basically a writer that Marvel invented. I don't know if that's true or not, but one of those weird conspiracy theories. But what this story basically did is it detailed how Thor became worthy. It was basically Loki, Sif, and Odin's son going off and fighting a dragon or something like that. Odin's son still couldn't lift his hammer, so he went to go see the Norns, and they basically said, look, Sif is going to be kidnapped by frost giants. You're going to go rescue her, and that's what's going to make you worthy. Literally, he fell in love with a chick. He saved her from frost giants, and so he was worthy to wield his hammer. It was never a great, big, huge, drawn out thing. But what this does is it kind of goes back to that, and it seems to like remove that from the landscape. Now, we're not told why Odin's son can't lift his hammer other than the fact that he's not worthy. And so because of that, he's just not able to pick it up. So it's still very much a driving force in terms of his character, in terms of him trying to do what it is that he can do. Now, of course, this goes directly into the idea that like Odin is basically being a jerk. Odin is like the father that's trying to instill discipline in his son, and his son's like, I really don't want to have anything to do with that. Now, keep in mind, this is not out of the character for Odin's son. Odin's son, when he was younger, was basically foolhardy. He was brash. He would go out and just do these ridiculous things, and he was really more arrogant and cocky than anything else. In order to teach him what it meant to be humble, the idea was put forward that Odin had basically put Thor in the body of a guy named Donald Blake in order to teach him what it meant to basically be powerless. But the idea here is that with these delegation of gods, showing up, Thor basically disobeys his dad, and he's like, whatever, man, I just want to go have fun. Now, this comes by way of the fact that Thor actually overhears a prayer from a Viking. Odin's son can hear the prayers of people on Earth. Sometimes he'll answer, sometimes he won't. But in this instance, he basically just hears a prayer from a Viking saying, hey, look, we decided we wanted to invade Egypt. And we came across a guy that we can't beat. So like maybe Thor will help us. And so of course, when Odin's son shows up, we basically end up finding out that this is Apocalypse. Now, my initial thought when I first saw this is, okay, maybe Jason Aaron is retconning something else, but what they actually do is reference Uncanny Avengers. Now, for those of you guys who don't know and who never read that story, Uncanny Avengers basically offered an explanation for the battle axe of Jarnbjorn. When it comes to Odin's son's character, the hammer is the most recognizable weapon that he possesses. But Jarnbjorn, the battle axe he uses, is actually in a lot of ways just as capable, if not a little more capable. And the reason why is because originally Jarnbjorn was just a battle axe. It was just a piece of metal attached to a stick, and Thor would use it to like fight bad guys. It was basically the weapon he used in the time when he was waiting to be able to wield his hammer. But what ended up happening in Uncanny Avengers is there was a story where we basically jumped back into the past and we found that Thor fought Apocalypse for the very first time. The problem with this is that because Apocalypse uses celestial technology, basically technology belonging to a super advanced and insanely powerful alien race, it basically made him impervious to any of the damage that Thor could possibly inflict on him using Mjolnir. And so because of this, Odin's son basically went back and had the axe magically enchanted. It's now one of the most prominent weapons that he uses. Because of this, in the midst of this battle, of course, Odin's son makes reference to facing off against Apocalypse again. Now, of course, this basically coincides with the arrival of Jane Foster. Now, this is the ongoing theme of Generations. The newer characters are basically just thrust into the past and exist alongside their older counterparts. We're not told how they get there. We're not told who sent them there. Now, the general idea seems to be that this question is going to be answered in Marvel Legacy #1, the one-shot that's setting the stage for everything that comes after Secret Empire. But of course, this is basically Jason Aaron sort of hitting at the crowd that doesn't like Jane Foster versus the crowd that does. And it's really just like Odin's son's reaction to saying, how could a woman possibly wield the hammer of Thor? Now, that's a little heavy-handed, but still, you know, it's really just kind of that reaction of how could you possibly lift the hammer that belongs to me? What this does is it, of course, has the two of them teaming up, kind of putting their differences aside for a second, and ultimately teaming up. Now, as powerful as Apocalypse is, he's not able to stand against both of them. Now, again, that's kind of the funny thing about this. Apocalypse is one of those villains in Marvel Comics where he is as powerful as he needs to be within any particular story, but up to a certain point. The guy can basically do everything, but there's limits to how far his power can go in terms of what he can do. Like, case in point, if Apocalypse were to fight Thanos, for example, Thanos would probably just trash him. I mean, I really can't think of a scenario where Apocalypse would remotely stand a chance against Thanos. Regardless of the circumstances, of course, it's basically Odin's son facing off against these soldiers of Apocalypse, and then, of course, Jane Foster trying to face off against Apocalypse himself. Now, for the most part, they're pretty readily able to hold their own. As powerful as Apocalypse is, Apocalypse just is not able to stand against both. And again, this is not unestablished territory. In the whole Uncanny Avengers story, with Odin's son using the enchanted battle axe of Mjolnir, he was able to almost cut off the arm of Apocalypse. So, you know, that battle axe is being used now in conjunction with the hammer, basically just sends Apocalypse reeling. I mean, that's really it. Now, we don't really find out what happens to him, and we're just kind of left to, you know, basically be told he's defeated, and that's really about it. The focus of the story isn't necessarily the battle of Apocalypse. I mean, there's no way he can go against two Thors, you know, and presumably win. But at the same time, he also kind of could. The most insane display of his power came during the Secret War story, came during the final battle that was written by Jonathan Hickman going into All New, All Different Marvel. And in that story, remember, they had the Thor Corps, which was basically all these different characters that existed throughout the multiverse of Marvel Comics who had been chosen to lift the hammer of Thor, and they were basically the police force of Battleworld. But the idea here is that in this final battle, Apocalypse fought an army of Thors. Like, he fought so many of them and like wrecked them all. So because of that, I mean, there's precedence for him winning. Now, for the sake of this story, of course, he ends up losing just because of the fact that, you know, it's like, well, hey, he's got to lose. But ultimately, again, this feeds back into the Thor son of Asgard story, because where the Norns had originally told Odin's son, hey, look, you're going to save Sif, you're going to disobey your father's orders, you're going to battle frost giants, you're going to save Sif's life, and then you're going to be worthy of wielding the hammer. In this case, it is the same message, but by a different means. He's already disobeyed the orders of his father. He already raced off and fought some unbelievable foe, which is basically Apocalypse. And then he, you know, ends up saving the life of, well, really just the Vikings, because they would have just been obliterated by Apocalypse. But then it's really Jane Foster coming along and saying, you will lift your hammer. I know you will lift your hammer because it's by virtue of you that I learned what it meant to wield a hammer. And that's why I say this, that's the reason why Jane Foster's story is so cool. The idea here is that with Jane Foster, she learned how to become Thor by watching Thor, by watching Odin's son be a superhero. She was literally just following in his footsteps. Now, her story is a lot more diverse and a lot more intriguing, because instead of just picking up the hammer one day and saying, now let's go fight with the Avengers, suddenly it was, she picks up the hammer, she dons Thor, she's fighting a battle against everybody in Asgard that says you're not really Thor, you don't have the right to lift that hammer, as well as fighting against the various enemies and forces of her own story and the Avengers and so on and so forth. So that's why I say her story, as short as it's going to be, is pretty interesting, and it's still pretty fun to check out because there's so much much that goes on. Again, it's one of those cool situations when it comes to like the character of Odin's son and his progression over the years versus Jane Foster's progression, as short as it's been. But with this particular thing, what this does, it is actually ends on a pretty huge reveal. And what we end up finding out here is that Odin and the Phoenix Force apparently had a relationship at some point in the past. Now, this is kind of weird here. This is all new territory. For those of you guys who are not familiar with the origin of the Phoenix Force, that origin was given in Excalibur, and I cannot remember the issue for the life of me. But the idea here is that the Phoenix Force represents the sum total of all life in the multiverse. That's why it is that you have one Phoenix Force that exists throughout the multiverse, and different people will be a host for the Phoenix in different universes. Now, how that universe unfolds is entirely different. When it comes to the origin of the Phoenix, all we ever really knew was that there was just like a sorcerer supreme from a different universe. And this guy basically wanted to converge all the universes into one and give himself absolute power. And because the Phoenix Force had never really tasted mortal whims and wants, which meant that the Phoenix Force had never really encountered mortal beings, when the Phoenix Force encountered this sorcerer supreme, it basically duped her. Like it preyed on the fact that the Phoenix was extremely naive. And so it was like, hey, look, establish these little pillars around these different universes, and then all will be well. And then once the Phoenix realized what was going on, it destroyed everything. It basically eliminated these pillars and then took off. Now that of course leads into the Phoenix eventually encountering Jean Grey, but there's never been an instance in the history of Marvel Comics that ever indicated the Phoenix and Odin ever had any measure of a relationship. Again, this is all new stuff. Now again, this leads into Marvel Legacy and is setting the stage for what happens next going into the line of Thor stories. At least this tail bit with regards to Odin most likely does. I mean, the whole part of like Unworthy Thor meeting Jane Foster, that's just telling the story for the sake of a story. Anyway, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.